The Genesis story. Welcome to part 8, in a series of presentations looking at the book of Genesis, and I've entitled this Depravity and Rescue. We're going to be looking in this presentation at the latter part of Genesis chapter 6 through towards the end of chapter 8. Reflecting back a bit on chapter 6 and on previous chapters, the author has pictured true humanity. This rests on God giving to us humans something of the divine nature. He breathed into us, is how the author has described it. We don't just work by instinct. This shows in two ways. The writer describes us as made in his image and made in his likeness. The image speaks about us doing what God does. God, the great creator. So we human beings, we've been given this fantastic capacity to be creative. And likeness, something of the nature of God. We have the spiritual sensitivity, awareness of that which is beyond us, and the capacity to care for others. This can be described as true sonship. We are sons and daughters of the Most High God, the mighty creator of the universe. This is the picture that the author has given to us. That's his intention. That's his purpose. We messed up. We rebelled. Our lifespan is restricted to about 3 generations. And the certainty of immortality is denied to us. And life beyond death, in any real sense, can only be restored by God's grace and God's goodness. That's the picture that the writer has given to us in the early chapters of Genesis. Now, the author very much is focusing on the family lines which lead to a man called Abram, formerly Abram. There are 3 brothers, Cain, Abel, and Seth. But 2 of them kind of disappear from view. Now, this is very typical of the writer to Genesis. He gives information about the less important family lines, and then he comes back and spends most of his time on the important family line, in this case, the family line of the youngest, Seth. And that line leads to Noah. And eventually from Noah, a descendant called Abram. The picture is of great creative achievements. Despite all our rebellion and all our failure, all our selfishness, all our corruption, we human beings are capable of the most amazing creative achievements. Just look at the history of the world. But at the same time, the writer here is picturing a world, the world of Mesopotamia, a world that's collapsed into total moral depravity. And that's the strange enigma about us human beings. We're capable of the highest things, we're capable of the most horrendous things because of our rebellion. We're going to be looking at the second family history. The first was from Adam. Now we're going to be looking at Noah. It starts in the traditional way. This is the account of Noah and his family. And it goes on, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. He had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Let's focus on the first part of this text, the second family history. There were 3 sons. In different places, the order of the sons is given differently, so we can't be 100% sure who was the youngest and who was the oldest. That word tends to reflect how we behave towards other people, whereas that word tends to reflect our relationship and how we behave towards God. that little phrase there is very much to do with relationships. Let's take this a little bit further, because there's a progression here. From righteous to blameless to walking with God. A gradation. That word is common in the Old Testament, and it's used both of humans and of God. This word is still common, but not as common, but it doesn't usually get applied to people so much, only occasionally. It's more often applied to animals that are flawless, ready for sacrifice. But that phrase is only used of two people, Noah and Enoch. You can see the gradation. If we look at this word, it's got a kind of legal sense. It describes someone who has got some kind of moral principles, a good person, someone who seeks to do good to others. Blameless, that implies a kind of wholeness or completeness, not perfection. And it's most often used of animals that don't have any obvious blemish or defect, animals that are good enough for sacrifice. People were to bring their best and give it to God. Now, very fine people like Abraham, Isaac, and some very godly kings, they are described as walking before God. But Noah and Enoch alone, walking with God, speaks of our relationship as a human being goes throughout life, a relationship of trust and agreement with our Maker. A remarkable picture for Noah. A good man, yes. That's often described as a kind of prerequisite if we're going really to get close to God. And that's the being close with God. Sharing his agenda, walking life his way. But we've got to watch. That doesn't mean sinless. And that doesn't mean perfect. That means that we're sharing God's diagnosis, his agenda, his way of doing things. We're recognizing that he is the creator, he knows best. We live his way. A beautiful gradation of description. Now it says in the text, Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. Now you might at first impression think that Noah had one favour, he'd impressed God. It's because the translation just slightly is misleading. The word translated favour there is actually the word grace. Grace means God doing for Noah what he didn't deserve and couldn't do for himself. Noah couldn't save himself and his family. God showed him how to do it. God warned him. Yes, because Noah was righteous, blameless, and walking with God, Noah was prepared to obey God, to see it his way. But it's grace, not super goodness, impressing God. We can't impress God. Nobody can, not even Noah. Only by God's grace can anyone be rescued. And Noah is no exception. Back to the text again. Let's focus on the second half. Now you may notice one word occurs a few times. Do you see the exception at the bottom? In fact, in the Hebrew, it's the same word. To corrupt and to destroy, the same word is used. An interesting observation. The word carries the idea of ruining something, ruining God's world, ruining relationships, ruining each other, ruining people and the earth. Destruction. Because corruption destroys. It always does. And the other word occurs, violence. In fact, full of violence or filled with violence. Now, violence could mean exploitation. Anything from exploitation to sheer brute force. What a world Noah was living in. But we look out in our world today. How much is corrupt? and how much violence is there. People exploited, the rich exploiting the poor. One religion violently imposing its will on another. Destroying our environment. Destroying people's reputations and futures. It's a grim picture, all because of human rebellion against God's ways. Back to this word corruption. I'm going to suggest that corruption almost inevitably leads to destruction. Look at all the empires of the world. Empires grew, empires developed, empires started to go corrupt. The seeds of their own destruction was built in. They blew apart. They fell apart. And empire after empire has gone. It's the same today. In our societies today, as corruption grows, inevitably the seeds of the destruction of the community, the nation, the country, the people group, it's there and it will fall apart. And tragically we can see examples in our world today. It's an inevitable principle. And in the use of language, one word describes both, because both are essentially the same. Corruption is destruction. This word, judgment. Now there's a biblical understanding of the word, and there's a Quranic understanding of the word. Let's look at the biblical understanding. God saw the hopelessness of the world of humanity. We were utterly corrupt, morally bankrupt. God saw the way that Noah was prepared to respond. Noah was prepared to listen, to do what he was told, to accept the guidance and direction. But Noah couldn't save himself. He couldn't save his family. God had to do it for him. That's the word grace. Yes, we could say the ark rescued them from the flood and Noah built the ark, but really it was God who rescued them. Noah couldn't have known there was a flood coming. And why build an ark in an area which was basically desert? It illustrates how God alone can rescue us from the consequences of our rebellion. Judgment in the biblical sense is God putting things right. It's positive. That's very different from the Quranic side. And we'll follow it up in a moment or two. It's interesting if you look at that passage. Peter here uses the story of Noah to illustrate baptism. I'll leave that one hanging. We'll come to it again in a moment or two, but it's one that after the presentation you might want to go back to. It's got some very deep thoughts there. A model of baptism. In a sense, the ark rescued these people from drowning. And baptism has the symbolism of going under the water, which symbolizes death, but being raised from the water to new life in Jesus, which is how the ark saved Noah and his family from being submerged in the flood. Interesting way, it's almost an aside by Peter, but it's an interesting insight into the way he saw the story of Noah. If we look at the whole flood story, not till well afterwards does Noah ever say anything. Maybe we can learn something from that. You see, God took the initiative. God gave the directions. He directed operations. Noah's great strength was he carried them out. Now, if you look at the book of Hebrews, where Noah is also mentioned, Noah is mentioned because of his faith. Now, the problem is in our modern culture, we think of faith as believing A, believing B, believing C. Sign here, you're in, as if it's some sort of intellectual process. In Hebrew and Greek, the word does not carry that meaning. It's a word of doing. Noah took God at his word and obeyed. God directed, Noah carried out the operations. Noah and his family were saved, rescued. That's faith in the biblical sense. God rescued the family. He was in control, he was in charge, but Noah had to cooperate and do it God's way. That's faith in the biblical sense. Some key features of the story, very briefly. We have to remember that there are many flood stories, and some of them were on the go before this story in the book of Genesis was written. And the book of Genesis is written to put the record right. If you look at some of the other flood stories, they are absolutely staggeringly amazing, the things that happened. Unbelievable. Yes, they're unbelievable. They couldn't possibly have happened. God's sending a flood because they were fed up with the noise that human beings made on earth, for example. But the biblical story is different from the other accounts. It's got an ethical basis. There's a moral basis. Humanity become utterly morally depraved. God steps in to put things right, the true meaning of judgment. If the people had got what they deserved, the whole lot would have been wiped out. That's not God's way. In his grace, he saved a family to start things again. Now, the word for ark just means a box. Pictures that draw us as a kind of boat are well away from, in fact, the reality of what the word means. A box. And it's a big box. Just look at the sizes there. Think of an athletics track. Think of the 100 metres, which is down one side of the athletics track. Add a third more onto that, and that's the length of the ark. That's a big box. Must have taken some building. Now, we don't know what the word actually means that describes the wood. It's been translated cypress, which is perfectly possible, but it's uncertain. Food supplies were taken in. They had to live for a year there. Pairs of animals, but are the animals what called clean animals? That's a definition that's not used till Leviticus, but the author is seeing that backwards. Then 7 were taken because they were used for sacrifice. God tells Noah when to enter the ark. The whole story is full of symbolic numbers. The writer is very clever, as the writer of Genesis is very clever throughout the whole book. Clever use of language, subtle use of language, careful use of numbers, a lot of symbolism. The whole thing lasted about a year. The rain falls, the waters rise, and eventually this box starts to float with the occupants inside. And towards the end, when the waters are falling, Noah uses birds to find out if land had reappeared. And then when they leave the ark, there's a sacrifice of gratitude because God had rescued them from the flood. Now that's just some of the key features of the story. Here's some particular verses. God says, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you." Establish my covenant, the word establish really means maintain or confirm. Now it's the first time the word covenant has been used in Genesis. Covenant is an agreement set up by God between God and humanity. God made man, and in a sense God made man to look after humanity. He was going to confirm that covenant by looking after Noah and his family. Later 2 verses say that. But notice that. Which one of us could rise to that standard? Everything and all? You see, he walked with God. He saw things from God's perspective, was prepared to do what God said, knowing that God had it right. What a challenge to us that is. Righteous again, a man who had some sort of ethical behaviour, not perfect, not sinless, but he knew right from wrong and was seeking the way that was right. And then the Lord shut him in, not literally, but it speaks of God in complete control. This is a classic Hebrew thought. God is always in control. I want to look at Noah in the Bible, but also to look at Noah in the Quran, because the influence of the Quran now in Western society is growing in quite subtle ways, and we're probably not aware of it. I want to focus on the Bible to start with. Noah is mentioned in several places. In Isaiah mentions Noah, but it's all to do with covenant renewal. God confirmed his covenant with Noah, a covenant to look after humanity, God's unfailing love for mankind. God's agenda is our benefit. Ezekiel, that's just a passing reference, and it's in the context of the word righteous or righteousness. And he refers to three people, Noah, Daniel, and Job, in this context. Jesus refers to Noah, but he's using this to illustrate future events which will come without warning. The flood came without warning. People were living their ordinary lives. The flood came. The writer to Hebrews mentions Noah. Touched upon this before, but it's in the context of the word faith. Remember, faith is not an intellectual word. Faith is a word of action. We take what God says seriously and we get on with it. That's what Noah did. I mentioned Peter uses the story of Noah simply to illustrate baptism, or maybe baptism illustrates the story of Noah. It's almost like a passing aside, but it illustrates how Peter was thinking. That's helpful to us. Peter also refers later about the story to God's protection. Judgment again, God putting things right. The world had gone sadly wrong. God was putting things right. Now let's look at the comparison with Noah in the Quran. Noah is mentioned all over the place in the Quran. I've just picked up a few of them. In chapter 7, speaks of people refusing to listen to Noah, who'd been sent to them, and they drowned. Now remember, the Quran was written possibly 2,000 years later than Genesis, but it has altered the story. If you don't listen to a prophet, you get punished. That's the point that's being made. In chapter 10, warnings. It's using Noah as an example. Idolatry. The writer of the Quran hammers idolatry, people worshipping anyone other than God. And warnings of what will happen. You'll just be washed away, destroyed, if you continue in idolatry. And then later, Noah being pictured as trying to persuade people to believe. But the flood came, and only Noah and a few others were saved. And the Quran has altered it by making one of his sons drown because he refused to enter the ark. We have to watch the word believe in the Quran because it's got a different meaning from either the Hebrew or the Greek meaning. The writer of the Quran makes it quite clear that believing, faith, is talking about believing that there is one God, that's intellectual, and believing that Muhammad is his prophet, intellectual. That's a very different thing from the kind of understanding of the word in the Hebrew language or in the Greek language. A passing reference. All prophets are seen as sent from God to warn people, and they're warning people of horrendous punishments for lack of faith. Back to this, believing there is one God, believing in his one prophet. And horrendous punishments are pictured on earth, but even worse, the pictures of what's going to happen to us in hell are terrifying. And then it just goes on to remind us how God drowned those. They refused to listen to the prophet, as is seen in the Quran, so God drowned them. It's a very different kind of emphasis and picture between these two texts. The Bible is much older. I picked a typical one. When we, that's God, resolve to raise a city, flatten it, we first give warning to those of its people who live in comfort. If they persist in their sin, judgment is irrevocably passed, and we destroy it utterly. How many generations have we cut down since Noah's time? The picture of God is so often a God who sets impossible standards and takes almost delight when we persist in sin, of just wiping us out and destroying us. It's a warning, endless warning. The Quran describes itself. The prophet writing it describes himself as being there to bring warning of God's destructive power if we persist in our sin. That's Noah in the Quran. That's typical. Let that fade out. This is how Isaiah, the great prophet Isaiah, saw it. To me this is like the days of Noah, said Isaiah, when I swore that the waters of Noah would never again cover the earth. So now I have sworn not to be angry with you, never to rebuke you again. Though the mountains be shaken and the hills be removed, yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken, nor my covenant of peace be removed, says the Lord, who is compassionate on you. Isaiah says that and makes it clear that God is speaking. That's a very different picture, isn't it? This is a different kind of judgment. God only has the best for us. God is seeking the best for us, and everything he does, he's seeking to put things right for our benefit. I stop for a moment and just look at yourself. Both these kind of concepts exist in our cultures today. A picture of God, a God of infinitely pure standards, almost like a divine policeman waiting to punish us when we go adrift. That's Quranic thought. Or God who made us in his image and likeness, and whose only agenda is our benefit, and who's seeking to put things right for our benefit. That's the biblical picture. We tend to get a bit mixed up in this. And we've drifted from the biblical picture sometimes into the Quranic picture. We need to look again at how we see God, how we see our sin, our rebellion, and how we understand judgment, God putting things right. Back to the flood. There's our map again. Now the whole of Genesis, this first part of the text, is focused on the area of Mesopotamia. Everything refers to that. All the descriptions are right for it. Even the rivers are described. That's the area in the buff colour there, surrounded by the pink area. This is a kind of flood plain of these two major rivers. That's where it's all set. It refers to the flood covering the whole earth. The problem is the word earth in Hebrew has got multiple meanings, the same as the word earth in English has got multiple meanings. We can talk about the earth meaning the soil in our back garden. We can talk about the earth meaning a country or a land. The meaning here is really land. The whole land. This land, the Mesopotamian area. I can't define it exactly, but that area is what the writer is referring to. That's the only world he knew. It talks about the ark resting, and it talks about Mount Ararat. In fact, in the Hebrew, it's hills of Ararat. That's an area. That's the area there. Can you imagine the ark and picture it as a great box, a very big box? It floats. As the floods rise, it floats, it drifts north throughout the Mesopotamian area. And as the floods subside, it starts to settle on the hills around the area known as the Hills of Ararat. It all makes sense. I can almost see it in my imagination. This is because the author's focus is on that area and the people who lived there. Later on, we can see how he expands slightly from this in a few chapters' time. But essentially, this was his world. He's interested in the ancestors of Abraham, this great key figure in God's plan for humanity. The writer is trying to explain the world as it is. He's had a revelation from God to understand why things are as they are, and why things happen in the way they happen, and why human beings behave the way we behave. It speaks of one creator God who made everything good. It speaks of that God breathing into humans. And we have God's image and likeness. We can start to do what God does. We're creative. We can start to be as God is. We have got a spiritual sensitivity. But we rebel. We decide we can run our lives our way. We don't have to listen to God. And it describes that rebellion. It describes the consequence of that rebellion in the things that we end up doing till the whole area becomes utterly morally depraved. We humans are responsible. We can't pass the buck to anybody else. We can't even pass it to the world of the demonic. We carry the can. We chose not to do it God's way. And there are consequences. We've lost our guarantee of immortality. Our lifespan is restricted, and that's it over. Our immortality has been taken from us unless God restores it to us. And that, of course, is the story of the Bible, as how God restores our immortality to us. But it pictures a God who cares. A God who made this remarkable world, where we're so protected and looked after. A God who allowed and brought into play the mechanisms that brought our world into being over billions of years. And a God who cares to breathe into human beings that we might have his image and his likeness. That's the author's focus. That's what he's trying to communicate. That's the purpose, and it's true to life. There's a lot of bits about timing in the flood story. I said the writer uses numbers cleverly. Sometimes we're not quite sure and understand exactly how he's using it. But there's a symbolism in numbers here. Just look at this. 7 days warning. 40 days. 150 days. 150 days. 40 days. 7 days. Now we have to remember that counting and time isn't like modern society today. This is a long time ago. And sometimes these numbers have got a symbolic significance. 7 about a week. 40, a long stretch of time, but not massive. 150 more. But overall, the whole thing lasted about a year. Again, we don't know exactly how they counted a year, but other records suggest that they had about 360 days in the year. So that gives us some idea of the length of this whole episode. Quite some time. It was a big box, and it was a long time floating on the water. Now we've got to be very careful that we don't misuse the story and draw conclusions that are invalid. There is absolutely no evidence of any worldwide flood, and this only comes because we take the English literally in our translation, and we look at the word earth and we say, well, the earth means the earth. But in the Hebrew it can mean many things, and the way the word is usually used, it's talking about the land. This was the world of the author. They had no concept of a world that was a sphere. They thought of the world as flat. Their horizons were limited. The world was built on pillars. That's why it speaks of water coming up, welling up. They thought of water under the ground as well as on top. Well, that's logical. It was a world where there were oases and springs. A world built on pillars, covered by a dome that was the sky, into which were studded the stars and the heavenly objects. That's their world. But the writer is only interested in the world of what we might call the Middle East, or part of the Middle East, because that's the only experience the writer has got. But there is no evidence of a worldwide flood. Some have suggested that the flood accounts for all the fossils and sedimentary rocks. That's completely misleading and indeed is completely wrong. You can date these rocks. They were formed over millions of years. And there's no doubt about that. And the fossils go back over millions of years. There is evidence of floods, but they don't explain fossils or the fossil record. And the reason why there are so many flood stories, it's not surprising. People settled in river valleys because that's where the greatest fertility was. They were beginning to learn how to grow crops. This all happened in the last 10,000–12,000 years. These places are prone to flood. And therefore there are flood stories. The big difference about this flood story is it's clearly referring to something very real, very big, but there's a rational explanation as to why it was allowed to happen. Because the society in that area had got completely morally corrupt. That's the big difference about the story from all the other flood stories. Key thoughts about the story of Noah? I don't think this story of Noah really is the meat and drink of teaching children. It raises too many questions that are difficult to answer and difficult for them to understand. Clearly God rejects the total depravity that had grown up in the area. There was a limit to God's patience. The family were part of that. None of these words suggest that any one of them was perfect. But God rescued a family in order to start again. Now the population of the area was not massive, not at that time. But God is going to start again. But that's His grace. He's trying to sort things out, straighten things out, put things right. Yes, the flood was widespread, not worldwide, but widespread. It lasted a long period of time, perhaps about a year. That was the way they saw the world, and the story reflects that. That doesn't alter its significance. But the story was written as a counterblast against alternative stories that existed at the time, where they had multiple gods. One superior god, sometimes, and sub-gods, sometimes lots of equal gods, gods arguing with each other, gods complaining because human beings make too much noise, and therefore they sent the flood to wipe them out. The Genesis story is built on an ethical basis. Moral depravity has its seeds of its own destruction built into it, and this was how it was destroyed in this particular occasion. There are real events there. The story is speaking about something very real, but it's written from the perspective of a God who is totally in control. Now that's a Hebrew concept and thought. Even natural events, they saw God in total control. Now we've got to understand the Hebrew language and the expression in that context, because that's not a Western way of thinking. Natural disasters are natural disasters. The Hebrew mind saw God behind it. Not so much sending it, but allowing it to be sent, in control of it, and often using it to advantage for the benefit of mankind. These are all Hebrew thoughts. Yes, a God who's all-knowing and all-powerful, that's Islamic thought. But a God who's moral and just. Now, just again is the same word root in the languages, God putting things right. The family didn't deserve it. As we'll see in the next presentation, they fell. They still had the same rebellion implicitly within them. But God showed his grace, putting things right, giving a fresh start, a new opportunity. The obedience of Noah is stressed. That's faith. Noah took God seriously. He did what God instructed him to do. That's faith. It's not intellectual, it's practical. But God says at the end, I won't ever allow widespread flooding to wipe this people out again. And as I mentioned, the human beings in that ark were not perfect, and the failures started to sadly re-emerge before the whole story ends. There's some key messages from this story. It's the start of a new era. Oh, that word hope is so encouraging. Always hang on to hope. Hope is not just a kind of blind belief that maybe, perhaps, somehow it'll work out okay. No, hope is the quiet assurance that God's in control and that his agenda is to help us, bless us, and make our life rich and fulfilled. That's the God who created the universe. Here is a new hope, the start of a new era. Genesis has described the creation of humankind, where God breathed his image and likeness into us. We rebelled and went badly wrong. God has had to decreate, to be followed by a recreation from the family line of Noah. That's a very deep observation from the story. I mean, to look to the New Testament to see the wonder of the way God decreates in order to recreate a new humanity through all that Jesus did. In a sense, Jesus, in his life, death, and resurrection, speaks of creation and then the decreation, undoing it as he did on the cross, and the recreation that comes out of that with resurrection, immortality open again to mankind if we're only willing to take it. This is a very deep thought from the story of Noah. We can see Adam, a kind of federal father of mankind, made in God's image and likeness. God breathed in so that mankind is no longer just an animal working by instinct, but having evolved from the rest of life, God has breathed in to create a new kind of creature where we can be creative like God, and we can be aware of the spiritual, which is God himself. And we can see Noah starting it again. A recreation, a new start from the floods and the disaster. Life re-emerges. This is a remarkable story, a deep story. A story that speaks of reality and speaks of God's grace, his goodness, and his love. In the next presentation, we're going to take the story of Noah forward, and I've entitled that The New Start.